Now you know better. Now you know that it's our children who are at stake.
Drugs were part and parcel of our operation there.
Why isn't anybody of authority saying anything about it?
Lines of Deceit, Cocaine and the White House, a production of the Other Americas Radio. Drugs, their production, distribution, and usage have become central to our consciousness. Each and every day, newscasts feature major stories concerning drugs. Front-page newspaper articles regarding cocaine wars in Colombia, drug smuggling through Central America, and the impact these drugs are having on our nation. U.S. forces invaded the country of Panama. We were told to oust that country's drug-dealing dictator. Government actions that in the past would have engendered widespread opposition have become acceptable in the fight against this latest threat.
My sense is that it's not really about a war on drugs. It's a war on a war of words, a war of propaganda, and a war to obtain huge sums of money from Congress.
Lewis Wolf is co-editor of the Washington-based Covert Action Information Bulletin.
The rhetoric that has built up around this war on drugs, as it's called, is unbelievable. There is an increasing willingness to use all of the cards, throw all the cards out and say that we are ready to do anything, including to chop away at the rights of people in this country, to say nothing, of course, of the agenda that we have in pursuance of this war in other parts of the world.
The stakes, according to the Bush administration, are high. The security of the nation and the very well-being of our children. Yet, amidst the administration's pronouncements, some glaring inconsistencies exist.
I think that you have to look to what the real source of this drug war is. It is a public relations gambit.
Christic Institute lead counsel Daniel Sheehan.
The operative dimension of it is the billions of dollars put into Central and Latin America and South America to try to help the people who are protecting the Medellin cartel. And that all of the activity stateside here is primarily to intimidate and frighten the middle class into believing that there is such an aggressive policy against drugs that it actually is threatening our civil liberties here. And then to ask them, is it okay for us to violate some of your civil liberties in order to fight the drug war?
Questions that remain unanswered cast real doubt on the nature and goals of this war on drugs. Questions like, what is the relationship of the Central Intelligence Agency with international drug producers and distributors? Were the Contras smuggling cocaine and marijuana as a means of financing the war against Nicaragua? And how is the drug flow to be abated if agencies of the United States government are involved directly or indirectly in the drug trade?
Well, I think that any person would look at the evidence and couldn't come up with any other conclusion.
Tony Avragon, a Costa Rican-based journalist, has investigated allegations of drugs being used to finance the CIA war against Nicaragua.
The Central Intelligence Agency set up a network. It wasn't as though that network was set up and then later abandoned and the cocaine people moved in. No, the cocaine people moved in right on the very first day. And the Central Intelligence Agency was keeping close tabs on that network all the time that the cocaine was moving through the southern front. The Costa Rican government is a very conservative government. Costa Rica is totally dependent on the United States for aid and its very existence. And it's understandable that Costa Rica would show some reluctance to make too tight a connection in this regard. But the various Costa Rican authorities, both the Congress and the prosecutor's office and the police, came just about as close as you could come to saying that the CIA was involved in drug trafficking. They did, in fact, in the case of the Costa Rican Parliament and then the cabinet, ban for life various CIA people, both official people, I mean, like the head of the CIA, the CIA station chief, and people in the National Security Council are banned for life for introducing cocaine trafficking to Costa Rica. That is something that has been done, and it's something that's in effect to this day.
The following two-part series, Lines of Deceit, will illuminate the shadowy underbelly of the drug war, exposing the relationship between the production and distribution of drugs and the financing of covert operations by agencies of the United States. The series will also examine the domestic impact of the drug war and those whom federal, state, and local law enforcement efforts are being focused upon. This program uncovers the reality of drug smuggling and its relationship to secret government operations. Lines of Deceit, Cocaine, and the White House. I'm Janet Perry. This is The Other America's Radio.
All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Drugs have strained our faith in our system of justice. Our courts, our prisons, our legal system are stretched to the breaking point. The social costs of drugs are mounting. In short, drugs are sapping our strength as a nation.
On September 5th, 1989, President George Bush, in a speech delivered to the nation via television, articulated his administration's edition of the war on drugs.
Turn on the evening news or pick up the morning paper, and you'll see what some Americans know just by stepping out their front door. Our most serious problem today is cocaine, and in particular, crack. Who's responsible? Let me tell you straight out. Everyone who uses drugs, everyone who sells drugs, and everyone who looks the other way.
As had Presidents Ronald Reagan in 1982 and Richard Nixon in 1971, President Bush now declared war on the drug problem. Daniel Sheehan is the chief counsel for the Washington-based Christic Institute, which, since 1984, has been investigating secret U.S. government operations and their impact. Sheehan traces the history of this third declaration of a war on drugs.
We are specifically repeating a series of announced drug wars that you probably heard about. I want to refresh your recollection about some of the history of these drug wars. On January 28th of 1972, President Nixon ordered a concentrated assault on the street-level pushers of heroin. And he set up a new office of drug investigations and assigned a new drug czar, Miles Ambrose. In that particular instance, you may recall, the war had to be waged against heroin and opium, which was somehow mysteriously coming into the country from Southeast Asia, where you may recall the Central Intelligence Agency had a major secret war being waged in Cambodia, in Thailand, where coincidentally happened to be the major source of heroin in the world. And on March 28th of 1973, Richard Nixon announced the creation of the new Drug Enforcement Administration. And he brought an interesting group of people into the government to work in this new Drug Enforcement Administration. E. Howard Hunt, Eagle Krogh, and a number of others that we later learned were not really involved in fighting drugs. 10 years after the original announcement of January 28th of 1972 of the creation of this major war on opium by Richard Nixon, 10 years actually to the day, on January 28th, 1982, President Reagan announced a major concentrated assault on the importation of cocaine into the United States. And he assigned a South Florida task force to interdict and stop this trafficking, appointing as the new drug czar George Bush, then the vice president, to stop this and to declare an all-out war on drugs. Now, at this particular instance, the drug of choice for the war was cocaine, which, interestingly enough, was being produced out of Colombia and being brought into the United States right from the very places that there was a major secret war being waged by the very same men who had waged the war in Southeast Asia, Theodore Shackley, Tom Kleins, Richard Secord, and the others. But in this instance, in an off-the-shelf, standalone. And what was that other phrase? Self-financing, covert operation enterprise. And so you can say, well, gee, there seems to be a certain repetition of this program, concentrating on the street-level pushers of drugs.
In his September 1989 address, President Bush stated, "First, we are determined to enforce the law. This means tougher penalties." Bush proposed the enlargement of our criminal justice system, quote, across the board. More prisons, more jails, more courts, and more prosecutors. To implement this, Bush earmarked more federal monies for drug-related law enforcement activities. The president stated that demand for drugs here in the United States must be curbed, adding that his domestic effort would focus on dealers and the casual users, who, according to the president, are the real source of the problem. Christic Institute attorney Daniel Sheehan.
Between 1979 and 1989, the supply of cocaine into the United States increased by 1,000%. Now, this is the period of time, you may recall, during which George Bush was the drug czar, in charge of stopping the flow of cocaine into the United States. And now he's proposed in his new program that we set up a program focusing only on the demand side, not the supply side, but focusing on the demand side, which is designed after a 2-year period to reduce the demand for cocaine in the United States by 10%. Which would mean, and as I said, I'm no math wizard, but this means that it will take this program 20 years to reduce the flow of cocaine into the United States to be equal to that which was in place when he became the drug czar. Now, you know, if it weren't so frightening, this would be pretty humorous. You know, on the face of it, the transparency of this is so frightening that his getting up and saying this stuff directly to our face is a little bit frightening.
Since 1986, the Christic Institute has been exposing the cocaine smuggling network and its relationship to secret government operations. Again, Daniel Sheehan.
The source of transport into the United States of this cocaine was directed from Colombia into Costa Rica to the farm of a man by the name of John Hull, a millionaire American rancher who owned some 50,000 acres of land in northern Costa Rica and was this extreme right-wing man working with the local chapter in Costa Rica of the World Anti-Communist League. And people screamed and hollered and said, oh, no, it's not him. And of course, now John Hull has been indicted by Costa Rican government officials for massive cocaine smuggling and is now a fugitive as we speak. And yet, when we shared this information with people, he was so crazy that he actually insisted upon suing our 2 plaintiffs for libel. And we went down and worked with Otto Castro, an attorney down in Costa Rica, and of course defeated John Hull in the trial and proved that it was true. But it took a little while to get the man indicted. And we pointed out that this flow of cocaine was coming through a company by the name of Figueroa Punta Arenas, in Costa Rica, a shrimp company, a frozen shrimp company, that was in fact run by a man by the name of Dagoberto Nunez, and that they brought the cocaine into the United States, into Miami, through a company called the Ocean Hunter Seafood Company, owned by Francisco Paco Chanes. Now, we could go on at some length here, giving you the details of the names and the places and how they transported it and how they distributed it, which is all in the complaint. And yet, when we pointed out that when the money was paid to these people that were involved in the operation, they also were flying the cocaine into the United States directly on the airplanes that were being used to smuggle the military equipment out of the United States illegally into Central America. We told where they were going at the Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador. They were flying on the John Hulls Ranch. They were unloading the weapons, and then they would load 17 duffel bags full of cocaine, 600 kilo loads, into the United States. And that the money that they were being paid for the transport for this cocaine was being used to purchase military equipment for the Contras. That one of the men supervising the operation was a man by the name of Ronald Joseph Martin, who owned the Tamiami gun shop in Miami. He had a partner in Honduras, a man by the name of Mario Delamico. This is the now fairly infamous Guns for Drugs supermarket in Honduras. And we pointed all of this out, and we were criticized, saying, well, you probably got some kind of jerk for a source who doesn't know what they're talking about, and they're fantasizing this, and you don't have sources that are reliable. Turns out that the sources were Ramon Milian Rodriguez, the chief bookkeeper for the Medellin cartel. Not a bad source. Luis Blandon, the chief of intelligence for Manuel Noriega of Panama. George Morales, the chief pilot for the Medellin cartel. Pilots Michael Tolliver, Gary Betzner, Geraldo Duran, direct pilots who gave dates, flight numbers, tail numbers of the airplane, coordinates of where they were landing, how much drugs were on the plane. And another man by the name of Jack Terrell, who worked for the Civilian Military Assistance Group of Tom Posey. We set these people forth, and we've told the American public about this, and yet people still say that, well, if that's true, if this latest of the series of charges that were made by the Christic Institute back in May of 1986 is true, why isn't anybody of authority saying anything about it?
And finally, President Bush stressed the need to, quote, look beyond our borders to where the cocaine is grown and processed. Bush designated 3 Andean nations, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, as the focus of the administration's foreign effort.
Our strategy allocates more than $250 million for next year in military and law enforcement assistance for the 3 Andean nations of Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. This will be the first part of a 5-year, $2 billion program to counter the producers, the traffickers, and the smugglers.
The military who are down there, who are going to be getting this $65 million emergency aid and an eventual $2 billion, are in fact directly involved in protecting the Medellin cartel.
Christic Institute lead counsel Daniel Sheehan. The president announced that the armed forces of these 3 Latin American countries would immediately receive $65 million in emergency assistance. Assistance granted to the militaries of Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, 3 armed forces that allegedly are linked with the Medellin cartel. The New York Times on August 31st, 1989, reported that regarding Colombia, quote, the cartels could not impose their reign of terror without the direct cooperation of high-level military authorities in that country. The Times report asserted that the drug cartel leaders are, quote, part of the oligarchy that rules Colombia. They have formed alliances with the leaders of the military. Yet, in spite of this and numerous other reports, President Bush is seeking to provide $2 billion over the next 5 years to the military forces of these 3 nations.
Now, you sort of wonder, I mean, does the President of the United States not know these facts? That the very people who are running those militaries are directly in alliance with the leadership of the Medellin cartel?
Christic Institute attorney Daniel Sheehan.
So you ask yourself, did the President miss this point? Did he fail to understand that the very people he's talking about sending the military aid to are the ones who have been working with the leadership of the Medellin cartel and protecting them, because the Medellin cartel leaders have been intelligent enough to know what the interests of the military, the right-wing military, is, and that is to exterminate the progressive political leadership in Central and South America. Not a new undertaking, we might recall. In fact, it was the very objective of their policies under the Reagan administration.
Pedro Alcantara Herron is a leading member of Colombia's Patriotic Union Party. The UP is the legal party that resulted from the 1985 agreement between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces, or the FARC. The party represents the reintegration of FARC members into Colombian politics.
What the United States is really interested in is not combating drug trafficking. The United States is using this moment, this particular historic moment, to do several things. First, to present an image of incapability of the Colombian political class to confront this very serious struggle.
Since its inception in 1985, over 1,000 UP members have been assassinated by right-wing paramilitary forces. Alcantara is skeptical of United States intentions.
The United States foreign policy wants to strengthen the Colombian military, because the real enemy in the line of thought of the United States military policy is not drug trafficking. It is to develop a low-intensity conflict through counter-revolutionary preventive methods that may stop, to a certain extent, the rise of the popular and democratic movements and any leftist intent to develop into new parties like we have done. Now, this is the real direction of all what's happening now.
In 1989, a U.S. Army colonel published an article regarding the drug war and its role in military planning for Latin America. Again, Christic Institute counsel Daniel Sheehan.
I think the most telling single piece of it has been set forth by Colonel John Wagelstein, who is an advisor to the State Department on the so-called drug war scenario. He, in the January issue of the Military Review, has stated quite bluntly that he believes that if the Defense Department can succeed in melding together in the minds of the American public the need to place military troops in Latin America to fight the drug war with the authority to use these troops to fight against the insurgents in various countries that are coming from the left peasant community, that they will be able to overcome this major effort to cut back on the military funding for the Pentagon. He says it quite explicitly in the Military Review. When you see that even on the front page of the New York Times, for example, on April 22nd, the announcement by the Bush administration to send the Green Berets in to northern Peru to train 6 brigades to undertake a major push against the drug traffickers and, by the way, the Shining Path, you're beginning to get a very clear idea of what's going on. I think that Juan Mendez from America's Watch has put it very clearly in an article that he wrote in the New York Times, actually back in October of 1989, the month before President Bush came out with his war on drugs that he announced on September 5th of 89. Juan Mendez talked very specifically about how it was perfectly clear that the military officials in the Andean nations of Colombia and Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru were in fact a major part of the problem with regard to the drug smuggling. And he pointed out in some detail the direct evidence interfacing military commanders with protecting the drug smugglers down in those countries, even to the point of pointing out that the paramilitary death squads that the Medellin cartel had at their disposal were engaged for the most part in exterminating progressive political leadership in those countries, that they were responsible for over 1,000 assassinations of members of the Patriotic Union Party, for example. And it was though this information were never communicated when Bush came on in September of 1989 and announced that he was going to be sending several $100 million as the beginning of a $2.5 billion military aid program to the Andean military to allegedly fight the drug war. It's very, very clear that what we really see here is an attempted rationale, somewhat blatantly set forth by Wagelstein in the Military Review, to cover a war against the poor, a war against the peasantry, a war against the organizers in the base communities throughout Latin America that have continued to struggle to try to set up some methodology of overcoming the oligarchy that runs those countries in direct union with the military commanders of those countries who've been trained for the most part in the United States and clearly financed with United States military aid.
This has been Lines of Deceit, Cocaine in the White House, a special feature from the Other Americas Radio. This program was written and produced by Corey Dubin, executive producer Eric Schwartz. Special thanks to Eduardo Cohen and Ralph Steiner. The music of Grupo Raiz, Inti Illimani, and Banda Tepuani, courtesy Monitor Records. The program was mixed and mastered at Coyote Radio in Santa Barbara. Audio cassettes of this two-part series, Lines of Deceit, are available for $9 from the Other Americas Radio, P.O. Box 85, Santa Barbara, California, 93102. Or for a free catalog of available programs, write to P.O. Box 85, Santa Barbara, California, 93102. Funding for this presentation was provided by radio listeners throughout the Americas. I'm Janet Perry. This is the Other Americas Radio.
There is a gigantic connection between CIA operations and drug smuggling in the world. The CIA is probably the largest drug dealer on Earth and has been for many, many years.
Well, you don't have to be an Albert Einstein to know that they're using the drug war for other purposes and other agendas, which have very little to do with stopping drugs.
Lines of Deceit, Cocaine and the White House, a production of the Other Americas Radio. Drugs, drug smuggling, cocaine, crack, heroin. Drugs and activities that have become synonymous with different regions of the world: Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, Mexico, and the United States. Drug production and distribution and the regions where these activities occur have received the sustained attention of the North American people.
The gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs.
Ironically, each of the regions identified are also areas where agencies of the United States have been involved in large-scale secret operations. The emerging picture is one of covert U.S. wars financed by the profits incurred from drug smuggling, the very drugs now surfacing on the streets of our cities. The same drugs that President Bush declared war upon. Drugs that, according to the President, pose an urgent threat to our children and our nation.
This, in fact, is a program which is consciously designed to facilitate the continued flow of cocaine into the United States, where it's threatening our children, not only in our high schools and colleges, but in our junior high schools and in our grade schools.
In part 2 of this 2-part series, we trace the history of drugs and secret government operations, illuminating the shadowy underworld of drugs and the financing of covert operations. I'm Jane Perry. This is the Other Americas Radio. Lines of Deceit, Cocaine and the White House. As the shadowy underworld of international drug dealing is illuminated, certain relationships and agreements have seen the light of day. Revelations of secret operations in Southeast Asia provided the first glimpse of an ongoing relationship between agencies of the United States and international drug producers and distributors. Lewis Wolf is one of the editors of the Washington-based Covert Action Information Bulletin.
Throughout the Vietnam War, and in fact since World War II, there has been a network through which the CIA was working, which was tied, linked, and beholden to the CIA, a network which included itself CIA employees. It was very clear to me at the time in Southeast Asia, in Laos in the 1960s, that drugs were part and parcel of our operation there. I remember Air America pilots telling me at the time that they were very busy carrying drugs in their aircraft, and of course the old saying was, "We just fly the plane. We don't care what's in the cargo area." Air America, as everyone knows, was a CIA-owned, created, and run proprietary. That, of course, was a prototype of these kinds of operations.
Since the close of the Vietnam War, revelations of secret CIA operations in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia have surfaced. In 1973, Alfred McCoy, in his groundbreaking exposé, The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia, detailed the relationship of drug production and distribution with United States secret operations. According to McCoy, quote, "Every aspect of these intelligence missions was somehow involved with the logistics of the Burmese opium trade." Bill Schopp is with the New York-based Institute for Media Analysis. He also co-edits the Covert Action Information Bulletin.
There is a gigantic connection between CIA operations and drug smuggling in the world, and a number of the reports which have been written, the books you refer to, essentially make the point that the CIA is probably the largest drug dealer on earth and has been for many, many years, even larger than the French, the Corsican Mafia or the Italian Mafia or the Golden Triangle warlords, all of whom are organizations with which the CIA has worked. And ever since at least the end of World War II and the very early days of the CIA when it was taking over from OSS, they've had deep ties with the drug smugglers, particularly originally the heroin routes that went through Europe, and then subsequently during the time of the Vietnam War with the routes that went through Southeast Asia. What happened in the 60s as well as the development of the Southeast Asian connection was the use of people and groups with whom the CIA had established political relations in the drug business in order to finance some of those operations, the primary example being the Cuban exile community. The CIA helped and worked with the Cuban exile groups out of Florida in their building up an involvement in drug traffic in order to raise funds for the anti-Cuban operations.
Christic Institute attorney Daniel Sheehan.
Well, right since the very end of World War II, when General Tai Li, who was the chief of intelligence for the Kuomintang, the so-called nationalist Chinese, fighting against the socialists in China, and were driven out of China by Mao Zedong into Burma. The first CIA station chief for Burma was Jack Singlaub, who sat overlooking the whole reconstruction of the poppy fields in the heroin industry that was being smuggled through the Corsican Mafia into Havana, Cuba, through the mob, and filtered into the United States for purposes of financing weapons for the Kuomintang in their so-called anti-communist crusade. The same thing happened with the Nazis who fled to Latin America. They became very much involved in the cocaine industry down there. Carlos Lerder, the son of an acknowledged Nazi, Werner Lotz, the pilot for Daniel Odebear in Costa Rica. His father, certified World War II Nazi war criminal. This is the man that flew Rafael Quintero Cruz out of Mexico after he was engaged in the torture murder of Camarena. These men are the struggling effort of the past generation to pass on to their sons their set of values. There are not many of them that have really accepted these kind of raw Nazi values. They're not the real source of the danger. The source of the danger are men like Theodore Shackley and Jack Singlaub and Secord, who have, out of an entirely misguided sense of loyalty to their country and their values, have begun to crush and exterminate those values. And when, in fact, they began to perceive themselves as being abandoned by their governments, and their mission was no longer being funded by a democratically arrived at decision. In fact, they were being formally prohibited from their activities. They then began to move back to the same source of financing that the Kuomintang had, the opium and the cocaine, narcotics, because this is a coven of men involved in that particular industry who will opportunistically seize upon any type of rationale for continuing their highly lucrative business. And they have seized upon the highly vulnerable men in this group I've been talking about, of the Shackleys and Secords and Kleins and Hakim, etc., as they've become more and more fearful of being ostracized and eliminated from the scene. They have desperately established a major alliance now with these narcotics traffickers to fund their operations, which are being prohibited by a new generation of American voters.
It's certainly not unique in agency history. The Inspector General, in the case of Laos, went and studied the situation after the publication of the book Politics of Heroin by McCoy. They were forced to take action.
Former CIA case officer Ralph McGehee. Ralph McGehee spent 25 years with the Central Intelligence Agency.
From the beginning of our effort there in 61 to 73, they had ignored the transport of heroin in these Air America planes by the Hmong tribesmen, winking their eye at it. The CIA's Inspector General, as it came out in the Church Committee report, said yes, indeed, that heroin had been carried on Air America airplanes. The amounts that were being moved were massive because planes were flying all over the country of Laos. They were flying into Bangkok, they were flying into Udon, they were flying into Saigon, and just throughout the area, and there was absolutely no check on any of the material that was being carried. And that's how a lot of the drugs moved out of Laos into the United States and into the markets in Southeast Asia. It's almost axiomatic. Any paramilitary operation in an area where drugs or where heroin or poppies are grown, you're going to have drugs being shipped by the people that we're supporting. In 1985, the Drug Enforcement Agency said that the majority of heroin coming into the eastern United States was coming from the assets we were supporting in Afghanistan. We know earlier the operations in Thailand and in Burma that much of the drugs were being moved by General Pao Siranan in Thailand that the CIA was supporting. And of course earlier with the KMT elements in Burma, we placed them in Burma to invade China under the supposition, the intelligence that if the KMT invaded China, then the people would rise up and protest and join them and overthrow the Mao government. Of course, that was the intelligence was ludicrous at best. Well, the KMTers went into China a couple of times. They got their selves beaten up fairly badly, and they moved back into Burma and took over the drug traffic. And we allowed all this to go on.
In 1980, another important expose was published regarding secret intelligence operations and their relationship to drug production and distribution. The book, The Great Heroin Coup, authored by Danish journalist Heinrich Kruger, arrives at some startling conclusions. Again, Bill Schopp of the Institute for Media Analysis.
The thesis you're talking about, which most recently was put in Henrik Kruger's book, The Great Heroin Coup, does make a pretty compelling case for the first of all, the takeover of the Drug Enforcement Agency by CIA personnel and CIA veterans, many of whom were people who were involved in operations where drug smugglers were used and drug traffic was used. And it was a pretty classic example of setting up a group of foxes to guard the chicken coops. And a large number of the people involved in the international end of the Drug Enforcement Agency and its related agencies and the White House Task Force and all are people who've been intimately involved in the other side. And the thesis of the book, and one with which we agree, is that at least a certain branch or wing of the CIA is up to its neck in the international heroin traffic.
This relationship was again identified in July of 1990 in a Los Angeles, California courtroom during testimony in the case regarding the murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena. According to one witness, those who allegedly ordered Camarena's murder believed that they would be immune from U.S. law as a trade-off for past support for the Nicaraguan Contras.
The CIA again and again steps in to stop prosecution of key people.
Covert Action Information Bulletin co-editor Louis Wolff.
For example, Rafael Chichi Quintero, whose name has come up very recently in the case of Enrique Camarena in Los Angeles, and a number of other cases of people involved with the Contras in Nicaragua. The DEA issued a public press release last year calling on the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, supported by the CIA, to stop exporting opium to the United States. It's interesting, however, to note that in the last year or year and a half, we are witnessing an expansion and a real growth industry. Some have called it the narco-industrial complex. There is, for example, new information that two gentlemen who have a long career, each of them in covert operations and special operations in low-intensity conflict, are now involved in this so-called drug war. And I speak of Claire George, who was the former Deputy Director of Operations of the CIA, a 25-year veteran of the CIA. And the other gentleman is Paul Gorman, who was the former commander of the Southern Command, a man who is known to be one of the primary architects of low-intensity warfare doctrine. And these men are now contracting through a company in Virginia to help Peru in its operations against drug trafficking. Well, you don't have to be an Albert Einstein to know that they're using the drug war for other purposes and other agendas, which have very little to do with stopping drugs.
Lines of Deceit, Cocaine and the White House, produced by the Other Americas Radio. In 1981, the newly elected Reagan administration undertook a major secret operation in Central America. The goal of this fledgling action was the overthrow of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua.
This fascinating covert action, which is unique almost in history and being open on both ends.
Former high-ranking CIA official John Stockwell.
We have no question whatsoever about what Washington is doing. It's admitted and debated very publicly. The Contra program, the Contra aid program, the president admitting it, everybody around him. If I tried, for example, to talk to you about the CIA's program today in Chad or Ethiopia, somebody could say, well, how does he know? Is that true? Is the U.S. government really doing any of that? In Nicaragua, we know what the U.S. government is doing.
In pursuit of this goal, the Reagan administration established a large support network for the Contras who were the centerpiece of this covert action. In the beginning, financing came from a willing Congress and administration discretionary monies. However, by 1984, Congress became reluctant amidst charges of massive human rights violations by Contra forces. As administration monies were depleted and Congress stopped the flow, the Contras and their handlers at the CIA apparently turned to drug smuggling as a means of financing the war against Nicaragua.
During the past year and a half, there have been three things that have happened in Costa Rica that have shed light on the connection between the Contras and the CIA and the Medellin cartel and drug trafficking.
Tony Avergon, a Costa Rican-based journalist, has written extensively on the Contras, the CIA, and cocaine trafficking through Costa Rica.
The first was that the Costa Rican Parliament, the Congress, formed a commission to look into the problem of drug trafficking. They carried out an investigation very much like the Congress might in the United States. They held hearings, they subpoenaed witnesses, they had a few investigators in the field, they gathered up testimony from other places and did a very thorough study. And at the end, they wrote a report which concluded that the problem of drug trafficking in Costa Rica is basically a problem of cocaine moving from Colombia through Costa Rica onto the United States, and that this problem did not exist before the introduction of Nicaraguan Contras to Costa Rica. And they went into great detail to explain how in the early 80s, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, and basically Oliver North's network sought to set up a so-called Southern Front for the Contras. And they set up the logistics network that was necessary to support that Southern Front. They built airstrips, they set up training bases, they bribed Costa Rican officials, and when they needed pilots to fly the planes to bring the arms to the Contras, they turned to their friend and longtime associate and partner, General Noriega. And General Noriega, of course, supplied them with drug pilots. And the Costa Rican Parliament said that after a very short period of time, the planes that were bringing the arms to the Contras began returning to the United States with cocaine, and that gradually the cocaine became the paramount reason for the existence of the Southern Front, and the Contras and the war they were waging against the government of Nicaragua really became a secondary reason. And they went on to explain that now the Contras are gone, but the cocaine trafficking is still there. And they made a recommendation, and that recommendation was then adopted by the full Congress and the Costa Rican cabinet, that a number of people be banned for life from entering Costa Rica. And those people are John Poindexter, Oliver North, Robert Owen, Richard Secord, the former U.S. ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Tams, John Hull, and the former CIA station chief, Joe Fernandez. And those people are now banned for life from entering Costa Rica. The next thing that happened was that the Costa Rican police, who have, to say the least, been reluctant to take this problem by the horns, finally, in the face of overwhelming evidence, opened up an investigation centered on allegations that John Hull was involved in drug trafficking and arms trafficking. They carried out an investigation and finally concluded and brought charges against Hull for arms trafficking and drug trafficking. He was then arrested. He spent several weeks in jail. He was finally granted bail and immediately jumped bail and was flown out of Costa Rica to the United States and is now a fugitive in Indiana.
According to Avergan, the third event was a new investigation by the Costa Rican prosecutor into the 1984 La Penca bombing. The bombing was an assassination attempt against Eden Pastora, one of the Southern Front Contra commanders. Avergan sheds new light on the motivations behind the assassination attempt.
The final thing that happened was that almost 6 years after the La Penca bombing, the prosecutor's office in Costa Rica, the equivalent of the Attorney General's office, ordered that an investigation of the bombing be carried out, but an investigation that would look into not just the bombing, but also why the bombing was not investigated originally. That investigation turned up a lot of information about drug trafficking. First of all, it concluded that the bombing was carried out by a cell within the Nicaraguan Contras with the help and direct support of agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, particularly John Hull, and particularly Felipe Vidal, a Cuban-American from Miami with close links to drug trafficking for many years. They concluded in their report that the La Penca bombing had a lot to do with drugs. They said that it was not only an attempt to put Pastora out of the way because of the divisions that he was causing within the Contra movement, but was also an attempt to put Pastora out of the way because he was seen as an impediment to plans by the Medellin cocaine cartel to just take over the entire Southern Front. So the drugs played a key role in the La Penca bombing as well.
In February of 1987, the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee ordered an expanded investigation into allegations of drug running by elements within the Nicaraguan Contras. The Foreign Relations Committee assigned the investigation to the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, of which Senator Kerry is the chairperson. While the more prominent Iran-Contra Select Committee failed to address the question of drugs, the Kerry Subcommittee conducted 14 days of public hearings on this issue. As the Iran-Contra Select Committee captured national and international attention, the Kerry Subcommittee conducted an investigation which produced what can only be called startling conclusions.
So you say, well, gee, you look at the president's announcement, and he said, who is it that's responsible for this? All of those who turn a blind eye. And what are we going to do about it? We're going to focus upon the low-level pushers and drug salesmen. So you sort of wonder, he may have read the report and not understood it.
The report concluded that, quote, in some instances, foreign policy considerations interfered with the U.S.'s ability to fight the war on drugs. Foreign policy priorities towards the Bahamas, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama at times delayed, halted or interfered with U.S. law enforcement's efforts to keep narcotics out of the United States. U.S. officials involved in Central America failed to address the drug issue for fear of jeopardizing the war efforts against Nicaragua. This, according to the conclusions of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations. Christic Institute attorney Daniel Sheehan.
There can no longer be any reasonable doubt that this is not an accident, that the entire policy of trying to direct our attention upon the demand side rather than the supply, to focus only on the low-level pushers and the street vendors of this stuff, and to specifically refuse to do anything to get the cartel leaders, and to instead send billions of dollars down to the military commanders who are working directly with the drug cartel, is not a laughing matter. What we're dealing with here is the boldest type of overt deception that the American people have ever been exposed to.
Lines of Deceit, Cocaine and the White House, a special feature presentation of the Other Americas Radio. This program was written and produced by Corey Dubin, executive producer Eric Schwartz. Special thanks to Eduardo Cohen and Ralph Steiner. The music of Grupo Raiz, Banda Tepuani, and Inti Illimani, courtesy Monitor Records. This program was mixed and mastered at Coyote Radio in Santa Barbara. Funding for this presentation was provided by radio listeners throughout the Americas. I'm Jane Perry. This is the Other Americas Radio.